Thank you so much. Thank you. That's very, very kind. Thank you. Well, you will see from the poster for First Circle and from the leaflets that the very top category is great minds. That's Bridie and Louise. And they've just slightly let themselves down because they haven't organised breakfast for us tomorrow morning, which would be appropriate if we were to explore this problem thoroughly. So I'm going to have to do sort of bullet points and heads of topics, and perhaps in the question session we can explore some of them a bit more. But we must begin with the distinction between populism, which is the main theme of this talk, and popular political sentiment or popular uprisings. And popular uprisings have happened in pretty well all societies throughout history, but that's not what populism is. Populism isn't a grassroots political movement. Populism is a political technique used by demagogues or people who cannot get quite the results that they want if they go through the normal institutional practices of an operating political order. By trying to circumvent it and appeal to groups of people in society who, at that particular point in the history of that society, are experiencing identifiable problems, which make them resentful, make them feel marginalized, make them feel that they've been left behind by what's happening in their society. And of course it's a continuing risk, populism, because all societies throughout history are always in the process of transition. All economies are always in a process of transition. Things are happening which leave some people behind. New techniques, new technologies, new markets mean that the economy and the associated society might be shifting its orientation, shifting its direction, and there will always be groups of people left behind. But there will be some moments in history where those groups are larger than normal because the changes that the society and the economy are undergoing are more profound than normal. Just think about the situation in most of the advanced and advancing economies on our planet in the last third of a century, and certainly in the last decade, since 2008 and the financial collapse. But it's a longer problem than that, because for about the last third of a century, the people on middle and lower incomes have seen their living standards stagnate. In the same period, wealthy people have increased their wealth enormously. Since 2008, middle and lower incomes have flatlined, but the top 1% of people in the advanced economies of the world have seen their economies grow 4 times. They've increased their wealth 4-fold. Now, in any society, when inequality becomes noticeably great, when it becomes too great, it begins to feel like injustice on the part of those people who are not sharing in the changes that the economy is undergoing, and they're certainly not benefiting from the massive increase in wealth that some people in the economy profit from. I mean, if you want an example of how an economy might change, how new technologies might introduce a whole raft of new opportunities and new circumstances, creating immensely wealthy individuals as a result, you only have to think of your favorite person and mine, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, who is a billionaire on the back of something which is not much more than a decade old, this whole social media phenomenon, which we'll talk about in a little while. There's a perfect example. Now, if you were somebody working in a sort of Rust Belt type industry, with low tech, automation, artificial intelligence, robotics coming into that manufacturing sector, making people unemployed, that is an example of how changes can leave some people behind and make other people very wealthy. And when that inequality gap increases and becomes too great, it's not poverty, it's inequality, which is toxic in a society. And when it becomes too great, it begins to feel like an injustice, and then things are ripe for demagogues, are ripe for populist politicians. And this is a phenomenon that we've seen, and we've seen populism bearing fruit for the demagogues in recent years. Trump, the Brexit phenomenon, what's been happening in Hungary and in Poland, the fact that Marine Le Pen got as far as she did in the presidential elections in France, all of them examples of how populism has become more of a problem. The populists have also had an empowering new weapon offered to them. Always in the past, populists have used propaganda and spin and distortion and blame, pointing the finger. We know who's to blame. Trump can point at the Mexicans, and Nigel Farage and UKIP can point at the EU, and Mr. Orban can point at immigrants and so on. Everybody's got somebody to blame, and then they can persuade people who are feeling the injustice in their society that at last somebody understands our problem, and at last they've offered us a solution, so we will give them support. And what has weaponized this use of propaganda and distortion and false facts and blame is, of course, social media. And I'd like to say something about that also. But in order to provide some background to this and to go back to my opening distinction, so I began by distinguishing between popular uprising, popular sentiment, a revolution breaking out because the people get onto the streets and raise the barricades, as they did, well, as they do in France all the time. You know, the French like to have lots of revolutions, so they do this very often, have popular uprisings, and that is not the same thing as populism, because populism as a political phenomenon is actually a corollary of democracy. It's a corollary of democracy. You don't find populist politicians or populist movements in non-democracies. You don't, for example, find them in the People's Republic of China, because the first indication or any murmuring of a popular uprising or popular dissent is very much stood on very quickly and suppressed very quickly, so you don't get popular uprisings. Of course, in the past, all the dynastic changes in China have been associated in one way or another with popular uprisings, like the Boxer Rebellion was an attempted change to dynasty back at the beginning of the 20th century, and indeed the transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasties was the result of popular uprisings, but not populist politics, because you would need to have a circumstance where there are elections, where there are political parties, where a political party can come on the scene to try to make use of the opportunities of dissatisfaction and inequality in a society. But in order to capitalize on some aspect of what a democracy is, but to circumvent the normal institutional arrangements. So populism is a corollary of democracy, but a distortion of democracy. And in order to explain why and how, I need just to do a very, very quick little history lesson, just a quick scamper through 2,500 years of thinking about this matter, if I may. And I'm helped by the fact that you were all of you reading Plato in bed last night, so you will remember from your study of Book 8 of the Republic what Plato's attitude was to democracy. As you know, Plato was an aristocrat. He had lived in the period when the Athenian democracy had failed as a result of the war against Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. Although, of course, at its height under Pericles, for more than half a century, it was the glory of Athens. And of course, it wasn't really a democracy. It was only for men who happened to be citizens. And the vast majority of people in Athens were women, children, foreigners, and slaves. And so it was a very limited kind of democracy. But at least it meant that people felt, if you were male and adult and a citizen, that you could go to the agora and you could have your say. So that was what the democracy that Pericles was extolling. And Plato didn't like it. Plato didn't like it for the following reason. He thought that the demos, the ordinary people, are too ill-informed, too short-termist in their thinking, too self-interested, too liable to quarrel and have differences of opinion with other people in the demos, for it ever to be the case that good, sensible policies would result. He therefore thought that democracy is really just a form of ochlocracy. What a wonderful word that is. O-C-H, ochlocracy, which means mob rule, rule by the mob. And mob rule is effectively anarchy, I mean, all you have to do is just go back over the revolutions that you can think of in history. Take a very recent example, the revolution in Egypt. All those people who got together in Tahrir Square in Cairo. Most of them, by the way, educated, westernized people who wanted a liberal democratic order to supervene on the tyranny of Mubarak. But of course, the people who start revolutions don't very often inherit them. What happens is that the anarchy that ensues is pretty well immediately followed by a tyrant coming in, because anarchy is exhausting and nothing can happen, you can't make any kind of progress, and so people welcome with open arms the peace that ensues when a strong man or a strong woman comes in and takes over. It tends to be strong men, women are too sensible. So the idea of ochlocracy that Plato said was what democracy really is, and the fact that it is too ready to collapse into anarchy and that therefore tyranny would ensue, this view of Plato's, which he of course based on his own personal experience of what had been happening in the Athenian society of his time, gave democracy a very, very bad name. And democracy had a very bad name for the rest of history, pretty well, until 101 years ago, until 1917. In 1917, a major world statesman spoke of democracy in affirmative tones. It was Woodrow Wilson, who was explaining to his country and to the world why he was taking the United States of America into the First World War. He said, "I'm doing it to defend democracy." The United States of America has been defending democracy ever since, as you can see, not always with happy results. But that was the first time that a major world statesman spoke of it in affirmative terms. You will remember that Queen Victoria in England in the 19th century used the word democracy and democrat as a pejorative. Oh, he's a horrible, vile democrat. We don't have anything to do with him. So when people were talking, as they did from the 17th century onwards, about extending the franchise, including more people, giving more people a voice in choosing the government under which they would live and the laws that they would live by, they didn't talk about democracy. They talked about greater inclusion or more say, always of course for restricted franchises. You had to have the right set of genitals, you had to have enough property, you had to perhaps have an education. Those were the qualifications you needed to be part of the political order. But still there was talk about extending the right to a voice without calling it democracy. So Plato had given it a bad name, and for the reason that I mentioned. Namely, he thought that ordinary people, the demos, they didn't know enough, they were too self-interested, they were too short-termist in their thinking. And this view has remained right the way into our own time. Indeed, you all know Winston Churchill said democracy is the least bad of a lot of bad systems. Now, people forget that he also said the strongest argument against democracy is 2 minutes conversation with any voter, because of course it immediately reveals this same problem that Plato had identified. And the American satirist H.L. Mencken put it wonderfully. He said, anybody who believes in democracy believes that collective wisdom will emerge from individual ignorance. So again, very much to Plato's view. But those views, Plato's view and Mencken's view, Churchill's view and so on, actually missed the point. They missed the point entirely. The real point about democracy was beautifully made by a man called Colonel Rainborough during the Putney debates in 1647 in a lull during the English Civil War. You may remember that Charles I had lost a few battles. He'd been put under house arrest in Hampton Court Palace. If you're going to be put under house arrest, there's your choice of place to be. And while he was under house arrest, the new model army met with the grandees of the army, the people like Cromwell and Ireton and Fairfax, in order to present to them a claim on what the new constitutional order of the country should be, now that they, the soldiers of the new model army, had risked their lives to get rid of the tyranny of a king who ruled by divine right. Now, let me open a little footnote there and just remind you of something, because it's really important to get the feeling for how people saw things and what the changes that were then happening really meant. You will remember that, you all know the play, Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Macbeth was premiered in Whitehall Palace, in the banqueting hall in Whitehall in London, which I'm sure you've seen as you've passed by. Still there today, beautiful building. It was premiered there in the summer of 1606. And it was very, very topical. Remember, the play is about the murder of a king. And because kings were appointed to their office by God, to murder a king was not just murder, wasn't even just treason, it was sacrilege, it was blasphemy. And just less than a year before, there had been an attempted terrorist atrocity in London by a bunch of Catholics who tried to blow up James I and his parliament. Guy Fawkes, 5th of November 1605. So Macbeth was a very, very topical play. It was bang up to date, like BBC or CNN or something. Bang up to date. And it was all about the attempted murder of a king. 43 years later, in 1649, from that very same building, the son of James I, Charles I, was taken onto a scaffolding and he had his head chopped off. Now, in Macbeth, the play, we are told that if a king is killed, the horses will eat one another in the stables. The graves will open and the ghosts will come out. The owl will fall on the eagle instead of the other way around, because the whole order of nature would be upended by this terrible sacrilegious atrocity of killing a king. Well, this didn't happen in 1649. When Charles I came out on the scaffolding, you may remember he put his little beard over the edge of the block to say it had done no harm, so he didn't see why it should be chopped off as well. He was the first hipster, you know. In that 40 years, one generation thinking about matters political had changed radically. The 17th century was a very, very important century from that point of view, the way people began to think very differently about things. And one of the reasons why it was possible for the crowds in Whitehall who saw the execution of the king, not all of them anyway, to feel that this was a terrible sacrilege, was because into the public discourse had come this conversation about the rights of the people, about the fact that the people should not be the possession owned by a single individual, inherited by an individual as subjects rather than citizens, but that they should have some say. And this is what Colonel Rainbow said in the Putney debates. He said, when Ireton said, look, you know, we're not going to give the vote to just anybody, because the soldiers of the army had asked for universal adult male suffrage. And Ireton said, certainly not. The only people who should really have a say in the government of our country are people who own property. If we give the vote to people who don't own property, what are they going to do with their vote? They're going to use it to take the property away of the people who've got it. So we're not going to allow that. And Rainbow said, the poorest person in England, the person who has no property, no education, has as much right to say who and what he will be ruled by as the richest person in England. He put it by saying, the poorest he has as much right to a voice as the richest he. He should have said she as well, of course. But that point, that democracy is about the mere fact of being a citizen, the mere fact of being a citizen gives you a right to a say. That's all. You don't have to own property or be male or female or anything else. It's just that fact by itself. And from that moment, from the middle of the 17th century until very, very recently, you have to remember, again, I used the example of the UK, after the First World War, because of the great contribution made by women to the war effort in hospitals, munitions factories, on farms. Women aged 30 and over were given the vote. This is on the grounds that by 30 women would have grown a brain cell or two and learned how to read a newspaper. And it was only in 1928 that the voting age for women and men were equalized. It was only in 1968 that the voting age was lowered to 18. Still not low enough in my opinion. So you can see that the development of democracy has been a very slow and painful one, and it took several centuries after Colonel Rainbow said, just in virtue of being a citizen, you have a right to a voice. But that initiated something. Things had changed. That's why the king could be executed. That is why in the 1680s, again, just to use the English example, the doctrine of divine right was dispensed with entirely. James II fled, abdicated the throne. Parliament invited William of Orange to come and be king in England. So obviously Parliament had decided that it was God. It still thinks that. now. But it had taken the place of the deity anyway in who says who can be king and what the powers of the crown can be. So things were moving. And again, the other thing you were reading, because you were busy last night in bed, I can remember, you were reading John Locke, the Second Treatise on Government. You'll remember there that he uses this idea that Parliament, meaning Crown, Lords, Commons together, represent the people. Now, he didn't mean that they were voted by the people, because they weren't voted by the people, but they stood there with the duty to serve the interests of the people. That's what he meant by his use of the word to represent. And over the next 2 centuries, in the thinking of Montesquieu, of the founders of the new Republic of the United States of America, Benjamin Constant, de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, a number of people contributed to this great question. How do we get from this, the right that people have to a voice, how do we get from that right to another right that people have? Because this was the other right that Plato didn't think that you could manage to secure for the people on the basis of their right to a voice. The other right is a right to good enough government. Now, I use the phrase good enough government because outside this room there is nothing perfect in our world, as you know. So you can't expect perfect government. You may not even always get good government. But if you could get good enough government, government that would protect the civil liberties of people, that would leave a space for people to make use of their energies and talents to make a good life for themselves and their families, leave open an opportunity for people to discuss, exchange ideas. Civil liberties, of course, being crucial to the idea of good individual lives that each of us might want to pursue. Privacy, freedom of expression, the right to assembly, the right to due process at law, being able to have an education worth the name, which is not possible unless there is freedom of expression and the opportunity to develop your ideas and so on. So we need good enough government for that. So we have these 2 rights, a right to a voice and a right to good enough government. Plato thought that if you gave people a voice, you would not get good enough government as a result. So Locke and Montesquieu and Jefferson and Madison and Constant, all these people put their minds to the question, how can we get from one to the other? How can we move from a voice to good enough government? And the answer they came up with was the institutions and practices that you construct to serve the interests of this very disparate group of people with all their competing desires and interests, the preferences that they've stated in the ballot box. If you can construct some institutions, not the whim of an individual, not a king or queen, or not something arbitrary which doesn't pay any respect to or take any account of what people think, but nevertheless which runs on the basis of a process, an understood constitutional process. And the idea they came up with was the idea of representative democracy. Representative democracy, where the adjective representative is a key term. What it means is, we vote for somebody to go to the legislature, to the parliament or the Congress, and we send them there as our representatives, not as our messengers, not as our delegates. They don't go just to report what the majority view happen to be among those who voted for them, but they go there to do a job of work on our behalf. They go there to get the facts, get information, find out what's going on, listen to argument, discuss, try out ideas, form a judgment, and then act on that judgment in the best interests of everybody. Because one very crucial fact about a representative democracy is that it is not crude majoritarianism. It's not about what the 51% want. It's about the interests of everybody. It's about how you manage all the competing desires and interests of the many different minorities who make up a society. And that's why you need representatives to look at the facts, to get the information, and to make the judgment. That's the idea. Well, it's a nice idea. And in my own view is that if you could make it work, it would be okay, where okay is about the best we can hope in things human, okay? It would be good enough government. But of course, as the franchise has been extended, so people who are interested in governing or who see advantages in being involved in the process of government have had to work at finding ways of controlling these institutions and these practices so that the interests that they have or the agenda they have can be worked through. And they've done this in a number of different ways, but mainly by increasing party organization, increasing discipline of parties, by, in some cases, like for example in the United Kingdom and the United States of America, hanging on to an extremely crude and primitive voting system, the first past the post voting system, which is very distorting and very useful for politicians, because on the basis of that system you can have majority governments on minorities of the vote, and that's what typically happens. Just to illustrate that, supposing you have a constituency of 100 voters and 10 people stand for election, 8 of them get 10 votes each, 1 of them gets 9 votes, and 1 gets 11 votes. Well, the one with 11 votes goes to the parliament, representing 11 people out of 100. That is very distorting. Imagine if every single constituency in the country produced a result like that. So the people who form the government and who make the laws are absolute minority of the population as a whole. It's an absurdity. And it has produced problems in those societies, like the United Kingdom and like the United States, where the first past the post system is used. Because, and I shall come back to this point, our new dangerous world of highly manipulative techniques that are based on what can be culled from social media, big data analytics, and the use of those is absolutely perfect for manipulating and distorting first past the post systems. Very easy to do, and I'll explain to you in a minute how it works, okay? So, here we have a long-standing debate, all the way from Plato up to our own time, issuing in the idea that representative democracy is a good thing. If we could make representative democracy work, these institutions and practices would translate the rights that people have into good enough government. And on the whole, because the idea is a reasonable idea, people on the whole tend to be signed up for it. Even in situations where there's first past the post, where there is very, very, very tight party discipline. And let me just explain to you what that means, okay? And again, I'll use the example of the UK. In the United Kingdom, there are 2 main parties, as you know, Conservative and Labour, and then there are always lagging far behind in the share of the popular vote, a third party like the Liberal Democrats, and maybe 1 or 2 other very small parties that hardly ever get a look in, like the Greens. The Greens have 1 MP in the current Parliament. Now, in that kind of situation, you need to keep a very tight control on your vote in the legislature. And they do this by means of what's very appropriately known as the whipping system, taken from fox hunting, not from dubious establishments in Soho. The whipping system, which is where you oblige the MPs who've been voted on your party ticket to vote whatever they think about the matter. In fact, I'll give you an example. At the end of March last year, a bill was passed in the UK Parliament called the Notification Bill, giving permission to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to notify the EU that the UK wants to leave the European Union. That bill, which was half a page long, was put together in a great hurry because the Supreme Court reminded the government that they lived in a parliamentary democracy and they had to discuss this with Parliament. So it's a very, very short bill. The white paper, for which, by the way, you know, a white paper is a document which is prepared carefully in advance by civil servants for the pros and cons and the facts and the figures and the impact assessments and the costings and so on, months in advance, so that MPs and the public could have a chance to think about it. Well, the white paper for this bill was published at 4 a.m. on the day after the vote in the House of Commons. It just illustrates the way our constitution in the UK has been completely and utterly messed up with. 4 a.m. because when you publish something online, it always has the time signature on the document, and the sleepy civil servant who had cobbled together some of Mrs. May's speeches for the white paper didn't remember that fact. Anyway, in that bill, notification bill, MP after MP after MP after MP were whipped into the lobby to vote for it, saying, this is a terrible mistake. This is a really bad idea. But they were whipped into doing it. Now, how can you tolerate the fact that individual members of Parliament who are elected as representatives to act in the interests of their constituents and their country can be obliged, forced into a lobby to vote against their judgment? How can that be right? Well, answer is it isn't right, but it is the result of this very, very tight party machine system. You all know that those of you who've had anything to do with Parliament, MPs, and perhaps if you are one, you will know very well the following story. You get elected, you turn up at Westminster glowing with triumph and success and expectation and anxiety, and you're welcomed by the whips of your party. Oh my dear, how wonderful that you've been elected. You're just the person we need. We foresee a great future for you. We're delighted. Now, come and have a cup of tea, and let us tell you that we are here to watch your back for you. We don't want you to get any kind of trouble. We don't want that nasty Daily Mail or anything to release any stories about you. So, if there's anything going on with your secretary, or if you've had your fingers in the till at any point, you better tell us now, so that if anything comes out, we can squash it. So the delighted new entrant to Parliament tells all their secrets to the whips. 2 weeks later, the new MP says, I can't possibly vote for that. And the whips say, oh no, well, if you don't, this is going to be in the Daily Mail tomorrow morning. That's one way they do it. The 3 Bs, blackmail, bullying, and bribery. Don't bribe people by saying, if you vote for us, you'll get a junior ministerial position. Blackmail. If you don't vote for us, we're not going to support you at the next election. You're going to lose your job. We're not going to back you. We'll give you money or support. And bullying, well, there was a case just 4 or 5 years ago when an MP was taken into the lobby to vote for his party line with his arm held up behind his back by 2 other MPs. That, by the way, constitutes assault anywhere in the United Kingdom outside the Palace of Westminster, where the common law of England doesn't apply. I don't know whether you don't know that fact, but very, very useful. The Constitution of the United Kingdom, which, as you know, is said to be a set of understandings that nobody understands, this is because it's not written down, is a very malleable and plastic instrument that governments have been able to use. Think of the last 4 referendums, the EU referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, the PR referendum, the Scottish devolution referendum. They were all of them run on completely different bases. Some of them with thresholds, some requiring supermajority, some with nothing, some with an extended franchise, some with a restricted franchise. You can make it up as you go along in the United Kingdom because we don't have a written constitution. But I'm getting sidetracked and annoyed, as you say. I'll get back to my topic. So you can see, so this idea of having institutions and practices has resulted in party politics. If you go back to read the Federalist Papers, perhaps you were last night, the Federalist Papers in the making of the American Constitution and the American Bill of Rights, you will see there Hamilton and Madison and Jay writing about the fact that the Constitution they dreamed of would be a Constitution which would be without factionalism, by which they meant party politics, partisan politics. Because in constructing the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Presidency, and the Supreme Court, they were hoping for a set of institutions that could balance one another and check one another, and that good government would come out of it. You look at those 4 institutions, only the House of Representatives is directly elected, but by the first past the post system, with a lot of gerrymandering. I kid you not, if you look at the voting districts in the United States of America, you would be amazed at the shapes of the electoral districts. Some of them are long, thin, bendy ones to get just all the Republican voters who happen to be, useful for what you want. It's extraordinary. So it's first past the vote and gerrymandered. The Senate is elected, but it's 2 senators for every state, no matter how populous. The Supreme Court is appointed, and the presidency, well, the president is elected by an electoral college, and the electors are sort of related to the popular vote in their different states and so on. But the reason for this college of electors is to filter out completely unsuitable, ignorant, stupid, immoral people from being president. Obviously it's not working, but you can see the idea. So the idea was to have structures which would ensure that you would get good enough government. The structures aren't working. That is the problem with our democracy today. It's not working, and that is why it is ripe for use by demagogues, and which is why we are seeing an upsurge of populism all over the world, in the United States of America, in Europe, and in other places. Look at Erdogan. You can even see that somebody who has built up a cult following, as Xi Jinping has in China, is able to use that fact to assume that if he makes himself president for life, as he's now done, that there isn't going to be a popular dissent to it. So this use of this kind of appeal to people, so these are dangerous times, you need a strong ruler, or we know that you feel very left behind and marginalized, we have the solution because we know who to blame. That kind of appeal which demagogues make is precisely and focally what a populist style of politics is about. That's what it rests upon. But it has, as I say, been weaponized, and it's been weaponized by what can be harvested from social media now. So let me just take a couple of steps back, and the people in the room, there will be people in this room who know this much better than I, because after all, my 21st birthday was long enough ago for me to be in the same situation as those senators with Mr. Zuckerberg who say, Facebook, what's that? You know. So here's what happens, okay? You know that if you're on Facebook or on Twitter, or you use Google or any kind of search engine on the internet, or WhatsApp or anything like that, you know that the providers of these services are quote unquote free. Nope, you're paying for them with your private information. You're paying big time for them with almost every detail of your life. They profile you. The main reason they profile you is so they can target advertising at you. They watch what you say, who you contact, what sites you land on the internet, and so on. They build up a picture of you, which is, they know more about you than you know about yourself, okay? So they can target advertising at you, but also for other reasons. Just on the advertising side, a friend of mine came over from the States a couple of weeks ago. He said to me, you know, I put on Google Calendar the fact that I had an outpatient appointment at a hospital in Manhattan, and for the next 3 days, I was bombarded with advertisements for my local crematorium. That is how closely these algorithms are watching what you do out there in cyberspace, okay? But it's not only advertising. You go on Google, you want to find out who's the fourth wife of Henry VIII. You go on Google to find out who it is. The answer you get, the answer Google will give you, is the answer that it thinks you would like to have on the basis of your profile. The information it chooses to pass on to you is tailored to your profile. Now, that should be pretty worrying as well. You think you're getting some information. Nope, you're getting the information it thinks you would like. However, big data analytics. So all your information, all of us, we're out there now, we are stripped naked to the view of any public or private agency who wants to know anything about us and wants to message us or advertise to us or target us in some way. So all that stuff is out there, and you now know about big data analytics. This is looking at huge numbers of data points. Well, in the natural sciences, in epidemiology, in reasonably neutral, morally neutral areas of social science, this is fantastic information. Looking at these patterns that you can discern, it's very powerful and very, very revealing. But when it gets into the hands of organizations which will remain nameless, like Cambridge Analytica and so on, when it gets into the hands of people like that who can be employed to construct messaging on the basis of this data and to use that messaging to influence and manipulate people, okay? This is how it works. In every election, but especially in a yes, no, in, out, Trump, Clinton, leave, remain, any binary kind of voting situation, you will have two blocks of voters. You will have the yeses and the nos, the Trumps and the Clintons. And most of those will have made their mind up pretty well near the beginning, and they will probably tune out of the process and the election speeches and so on, because they know how they're going to vote. But in between them, there is a group of people who haven't made up their minds, or who can be manipulated or persuaded, or who haven't really thought about it, or who don't know enough about it anyway. And if you could target them, you might get enough of them to move to tip the balance. Because you've got to remember that in voting, it is very small numbers of people who change general elections and referendums. Very small numbers of people. You may know that Hillary Clinton won more than 3 million votes, more than Trump got, but they were in the wrong place. Trump got the votes in the right place, and therefore he got the Electoral College. And this was because the people who were doing the targeting of his messages knew where to target. They didn't bother about places which were definitely Clinton. They went for the places where they knew there were dissatisfied people or people who hadn't made their minds up or hadn't even thought about it, and they targeted them. And this is how it works. They tested, firstly, they had all this profiling. They were able to group people. So there's this group of people here, that group of people there, that group of people there. These people really want to keep their guns and shoot people. These people hate immigrants. Maybe they want to shoot the immigrants too, I don't know. These people are worried about taxation levels. Those people live in a Rust Belt city like Detroit or something, okay? So they've all got their particular things that bug them. So they test messaging on them. They test these messages over and over again. In the autumn last year, BBC Newsnight ran a short program on the work of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica in the Trump election, and they pointed out that Cambridge Analytica tested some of its messages up to 3,000 times until they got the messaging absolutely right. And there are metrics for how many times people retweet or like or forward or comment or use phraseology from the messaging, so they know when the messaging is working. So they micro-target or hyper-target, as it's called, this group with certain messages. And that group thinks, oh, Trump's my man, oh, brilliant. So they've got them hooked in. Then they use a completely different message for that group. That group is hooked into Trump. And then a different message again for that. And so all these groups are aggregated. These groups might have nothing in common with one another. They may even hate one another if they know one another, but they've all been aggregated into a single voting block by these techniques. And moreover, it's not just that they've been messaged, but the messages in question will very often be post-truth messages. So you can take the example of the Brexit referendum, 350 million a week for the NHS, or millions of Turks are going to come pouring into England if we stay in the EU, or all these kind of distorted messages. But not only half-truths and untruths, not only messages that massage the prejudices and anxieties of people in certain areas, but they also send messages to the other side. For example, in the EU referendum, they sent messages to Remain as saying, nobody is stupid enough to vote to leave the EU, so of course Remain is going to win easily. So if it rains in your constituency on the day, you don't have to bother to go out to vote. True, this absolutely true. It wasn't just Cambridge Analytica, by the way, because everybody's got this big conspiracy theory going about Russia. I'm afraid it's true. Roy from Neasden turns out to be Vladimir from Vladivostok in a lot of these cases. Okay, well, getting involved in social media and sending messages. I was talking just a few months ago to a member of the security services in Australia who's in the department dealing with cyber warfare, and he was saying that all countries are constantly getting information and misinformation out there into the social media sphere in all other countries, using the technique for which the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded last year, remember? Nudging. Little bits of influence, little bit of just changing people's opinion, putting a different color onto something, making people think a different way. There is a bombardment of these messages out there from all the major countries capable of doing this to all other countries, happening all the time. So there's nothing new in this. If it were a policy, and it happens to be in the public domain, that Mr. Putin of Russia would like to see a weakened EU and a weakened NATO, then of course his cyber people will be messaging to make that seem, more likely to happen, helping those campaigns which were anti-EU and the like. On the day of the referendum in London, 23rd of June 2016, it bucketed with rain. It rained all day. Now, if you're a psephologist, you know that you can predict with complete accuracy the drop in the turnout in a constituency if it rains on voting day. The drop in the turnout in London on that day was exactly the predictable percentage, and the margin was bigger than the margin by which Leave won the referendum. And this was in part, not been a lot of different reasons, but in part it was because people thought that Remain was going to win easily. So, well, look out, it's bucketing with rain. I'm not going to put my trainers on and go out and vote. No need, going to win anyway. And that was one of the messages. And in fact, somebody has done the calculation. In the last 2 weeks before the referendum, there was something like, I don't know, 550,000 messages to that effect out there on social media. So harvesting all this personal data, identifying groups of people and targeting them. That is going to happen from now on. That is going to happen from now on. It's been happening for years. It's going to happen from now on. The problem with it is that nobody knew it was happening except the people who were doing it. It was not transparent. If somebody comes to me and gives me a message that they think will resonate with me, and I know who they are, why they're saying it, and who paid for it, then I can make up my own mind if I'm going to agree. But if I don't know, if it's from somebody, one of my 10,000 friends on Facebook, you know, all of whom I know so intimately well, who's writing to me and saying, oh, by the way, I'm fed up with the EU, and I think, oh, well, maybe I am too, and so on. If I'm being nudged, if I'm being influenced in some way, if my view about something is being weakened by something out there in social media, and I don't know that it is a deliberate attempt to nudge me or to change my, or to influence my opinion, then that is anti-democratic. So in a lot of ways, our democratic order, party discipline, the whipping system, the voting system, the fact that in some places like the UK we don't even have a proper constitution, now this weaponized use of big data analytics has all been very, very corrosive of our democracy. And that is why we are seeing a resurgence of populist politics. Just think of the following fact. In the terrible 20th century, the first half of which saw the most devastating wars, part of the problem was the rise of communism and the attempt to institute communist regimes and make them work. And part of the problem was the rise of fascist regimes, fascist kinds of imperialism and racism, and the efforts made by the fascists. In the course of the 20th century, communism, I mean not of genuine, true, we all love one another, sharing everything kind of communism, but communist regimes anyway, failed. They failed because they couldn't compete with the advanced democracies of the West economically. They just couldn't keep up with the arms race, all right? So communism failed. But fascism has not failed. Fascism, like embers burning in the fireplace, it's always been there waiting for the breath of the demagogue to blow on them and turn them into flames. And we've seen it happen in these last few years because they've been given this new technique, this new weapon to be able to do it. Oh my God, have I really been talking that long? I'm so sorry. You see, I did think they should have arranged breakfast. So the outcome of all this is that populism has been empowered by this very, very rapid embrace. I mean, after all, think about it. There are people in this room who spent their earlier part of their lives like me before mobile telephones and the internet or anything else even existed. Can you believe it? That was really the case. There was, I think, back in the early 90s, there was a famous example of a very, very, very posh and fashionable club in Soho in London caught fire, and everybody had to run out and leave their coats and everything behind, including these enormous mobile phones. You remember them? People used to go up and down the street talking on their mobile phones like that. And the next day they put a message out to say people would come and collect their mobile phones that they left behind. Nobody bothered to come, so they looked at the mobile phones and they were all plastic. They were all just pretend versions of mobile phones. Because people wanted to walk on the street. So, I'm going to remember an age before, but now we are all utterly dependent on them. I used to say to my students in ethics classes, I say, the basis of ethics is the fellow feeling that we have with other human beings. You know, if you saw somebody in imminent danger of something about to crash down on top of their heads, what would you do? You would shout out a warning. Hey, look out, doesn't matter who they are, what their ethnicity or what religious dress they're wearing, or it doesn't matter, you would shout out a warning, wouldn't you? And then I remembered this. Probably people would now say, oh, this is going to be interesting, take a photo. So technology has changed things, and it has given this weapon into the hands of populists, and that is why populism has fanned those embers. Fascism hasn't died. The far right, the anti-immigrant, the desire to command and control a society not merely from the point of view of its political order, its governance order, its economy, but social attitudes, that is an imminent danger. It's actually happening around us now as we speak, and it needs to be contested. Thank you.